What would you do if someone handed you a choice that had no right answer, and the wrong one destroyed everything? This is not a riddle. It happened. In the winter of 1877, deep in the Colorado mountains, a man who had spent 23 years running from love was forced to face it again. Two women. One question, and an answer that the world still struggles to understand. Stay with this story, because the lesson buried inside it is one most people spend their entire lives learning the hard way. The year was 1877, and the Colorado high country was a land that God had sculpted into something breathtaking and then left to fend for itself. Jagged peaks tore into a sky so deeply blue it almost hurt to look at. Snow fell 8 months of the year. The summers were short and violent, punched through with storms that could kill a man between one step and the next. This was not a place for the fragile or the optimistic. This was a place where surviving each season felt less like living and more like winning a negotiation with death. In a valley so remote that no cartographer had bothered to name it, there lived a man the locals called Robert Williamson, though he had stopped thinking of himself by any name at all. He was 45 years old, but wore 58 on his face, and older still in his bones. His beard was grey and untamed. His hands were maps of scar tissue from decades of trapping, building, and wrestling the wilderness for every scrap of existence. His eyes were the exact colour of the sky before a storm, blue-grey and far away. They were the eyes of a man who had quietly stopped expecting anything from the horizon. He had not always been this man. He had come to these mountains in 1845 as Jeremiah Cole, 24 years old and full of the foolish certainty that life would honour his plans. He had been a farmer's son from Ohio. He had been engaged to a woman named Clara, who had a smile that made springtime feel redundant. He had believed in the future the way young men do, completely, recklessly, without a single backup plan. Then Clara had married his brother instead. She had not told him herself. She had not looked him in the eye and said the words. He had learned it from a letter delivered by a neighbour boy who could not hold his gaze. She had moved the wedding date up by 2 weeks. She had married Thomas. And just like that, the future Jeremiah had been building toward collapsed into rubble. He packed a single bag that night and walked away. Not just from the farm, from everything. He walked until the land began to rise beneath his feet, and the trees grew so dense that the Ohio sky disappeared entirely. He walked until the silence was thick enough to stop Clara's voice from echoing in his memory. He kept walking until he found a valley that no one else had claimed, and he decided to stay. 23 years. He had been alone in these mountains for 23 years. He had built his cabin stone by stone with his own hands. He had trapped beaver and fox and traded pelts for the few supplies he could not produce himself. He had spoken to no one but the wind, the wolves, and occasionally his own reflection in the still water of the creek below. He had never remarried. He had never wanted to. The wound Clara had left had healed into scar tissue so thick that nothing could penetrate it. He had convinced himself that this was peace, that solitude was a reasonable substitute for living. Then they arrived. It was late October when Jeremiah first spotted them from his trapline, 3 miles from the cabin. The first snow had already fallen, and the second was gathering on the horizon. The sky had taken on that iron look that every mountain man recognizes as a promise of violence within hours. He was checking his snares when he caught movement on the slope below. His first thought was elk. Then he saw the blue and brown fabric, the pale flash of faces turned upward toward where he stood, and he understood. People. 2 of them, moving too slowly, using what appeared to be the very last of their strength just to keep climbing. Every instinct Jeremiah had developed over 23 years told him to turn away. People meant trouble. People meant questions he did not want to answer, and complications he had not asked for, and the end of the quiet he had so carefully constructed. He had not spoken to another human being in 8 months, and he had not regretted a single day of it. But the storm was coming, and even from that distance, he could see one of the figures stumble and fall, and he could see the other bend down to help her rise. Her. They were both women. Jeremiah cursed quietly into the cold air. He checked his rifle. Then he walked down the slope to meet them. Their names were Mary and Ruth. Sisters, though they looked nothing alike. Mary was 34, the elder, tall with dark hair already threaded through with early grey, and eyes that carried the flat, hollow look of someone who has seen more than their share of grief. Ruth was 29, smaller, fairer, her eyes still holding light, but the particular kind of light that knows it is running out of time. They were both widows. Mary's husband had died in a mining accident in Central City 6 months before. Ruth's husband had followed him 3 months after that, taken by fever. They had been left with nothing. No savings, no family within reach, no position in a territory that had very little use for women without men to provide for them. They had tried to survive in town. They had taken in washing and mending. They had endured the comments, the propositions, the slow erosion of dignity that comes from work that pays almost nothing. Their landlord had eventually demanded payment they could not produce, offered an alternative they refused, and thrown them into the street. They had heard rumours of a hermit in the high country, a man who wanted nothing from the world but was said to be decent. Decent was enough. It was more than they had been offered in months. They had decided to find him. The alternative was freezing in a town that did not want them. They had been walking for 4 days. They had run out of food 2 days before that. They had come close to dying 3 times on the mountain passes. And now here they were, standing before a man with wild grey hair and storm-coloured eyes, who was looking at them like they were ghosts he had never agreed to haunt him. Jeremiah listened to all of this without speaking. When they finished, the silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Then, he said what he said. He told them he had never had a wife. He told them he had been alone so long, he no longer knew how to live alongside other people. He told them his cabin was small, and his supplies were limited, and winter in these mountains was the kind of thing that broke experienced men. But he said the storm was coming, and he said he was not the kind of man who stood by while people froze. He said they could stay until the passes cleared in spring. He said they should not expect anything beyond that. What followed was the strangest winter of Jeremiah's life. His cabin, which had held only his footsteps for 2 decades, now held 3 sets of boots by the door. His table, which had seated 1, now crowded 3. His silence, which had been his most carefully protected possession, was now interrupted daily by voices he was slowly learning to tolerate. Mary took over the cooking without asking permission. She transformed his bachelor rations of jerky and dried beans into meals that actually resembled food. She organised his supplies with the efficiency of someone who had been managing scarcity for a long time. She cleaned corners of the cabin that had not been touched in years. She was competent in the way that people are competent when survival has been their only teacher. And there was a steadiness to her that Jeremiah found himself respecting, despite his resistance to it. Ruth was different. Quieter. She spent hours with the handful of books Jeremiah had accumulated over the years, turning pages with a care that suggested she understood they were precious. She asked him questions about the mountains, about the animals, about the way the light shifted on the peaks at different hours of the day. And she listened to his answers. Not politely, actually listened. The way people do when they find what someone is saying genuinely interesting. Jeremiah had not been listened to in 23 years. He had forgotten what it felt like. He found himself talking more than he had in 2 decades. At first, just short answers, grunts, single sentences. Then longer ones. Then stories he had not told anyone. About the wolf pack he had watched grow over 15 years. About the eagle that nested on the cliff above his cabin every spring. About the seasons and their rhythms, and the particular beauty of high country silence in deep January. He did not speak of Ohio. He did not speak of Clara. Some doors stay closed not because they are locked, but because the person holding the key has decided the room behind them is not worth entering again. The weeks turned into months. December surrendered to January, January to February. The snow piled higher than the windows. The world compressed down to the size of one small cabin and 3 people learning, slowly, awkwardly, how to exist in the same space. Here is where the story begins to teach something real. Here is the lesson most people miss. Jeremiah began to notice things. The way Mary watched him when she thought he was not looking. The way his coffee was always ready before he woke. The way she asked about his day with an interest that went beyond courtesy. And Ruth, the way her face changed when he entered the room. The way she saved passages from books to read aloud in the evenings. The way her hand sometimes brushed his when she passed him something at the table. 2 women, both of them looking at him with something in their eyes he had not seen directed at himself in more than 20 years. Jeremiah did not know what to do. He had structured his entire existence around the absence of this feeling. He had convinced himself that the chapter was closed, the language forgotten, the need cauterized out of existence. And now here it was, reopening on its own, reading itself back to him in a cabin buried under Colorado snow. The confrontation came in March. The first hints of spring were beginning to appear at the lower elevations, which meant the passes would clear soon, which meant the decision that had been building all winter could no longer be postponed. Mary and Ruth had been whispering between themselves for days, private conversations that stopped when Jeremiah walked into a room. A tension building that even a man as practiced in solitude as he was could not ignore. One evening after dinner, Mary stood. Ruth rose beside her. They had clearly rehearsed this moment, gathered themselves for it across several days of quiet courage building. Mary spoke first. She said they could not return to Central City. There was nothing there for them. No future, no safety, no ground that would hold. She said they had found something in this cabin they had not expected. A sense of purpose, of calm, of something that felt like it could become a home if they were allowed to stay. Ruth added that she understood Jeremiah valued his solitude. She said she understood 23 years of it was not nothing. She said she would not blame him if he asked them to leave when the snow cleared. But she said she hoped he would ask them to stay. Then Mary said the thing that hung in the cold air like smoke. She said they were not fools. They both knew what had grown in that cabin over those months. They had talked about it between themselves, honestly, without jealousy. If he wanted either of them as a wife, they would accept. He only had to choose. Choose one of us. The silence that followed was deeper than any Jeremiah had inhabited in all his years of solitude. He looked at these 2 women who had stumbled into his life half dead, who had asked for nothing but survival, who had given something in return that he had never asked for and had not known he needed. He looked at the hope in their faces, the vulnerability of people offering something precious and waiting to find out whether it would be accepted or crushed. He thought of Clara. He thought of what it felt like to be chosen against, to learn it from a neighbor boy who could not hold his gaze. He thought of the 2 decades of scar tissue he had built in response to that single moment. And then he understood something. Something that took him a long time to find the words for. He said he would not choose. Not because he did not care. Because choosing meant losing. It meant taking something whole and breaking it. It meant creating a wound between 2 sisters who had already lost enough. He said he had seen what rejection did to people. He had lived inside it for more than half his life. He said he wanted them both to stay, not as competition, not as options, but as family. He said he did not know how to be a husband. He had been alone too long to pretend otherwise. But he could give them a home. He could give them safety. A life away from the cruelty of the world below. They could build something together, something without a name, because the world had not yet imagined it. 3 broken people who had found each other against every reasonable probability. He said the choice was not his to make alone. It was theirs, too. And he asked if that was enough. Mary and Ruth looked at each other. Something passed between them, the wordless conversation of people who have been through enough together that language becomes redundant. Then they both turned back to him and said yes. The years that followed rewrote everything Jeremiah believed about himself. The cabin grew. He built a larger kitchen for Mary. He built a reading nook with a window that caught the afternoon light for Ruth. He built a front porch where all three of them sat on summer evenings, watching the sun lower itself behind the peaks. They found their rhythms. Mary ran the household with her fierce, quiet efficiency. Ruth brought beauty into every corner, with small touches that required nothing but attention and care. Jeremiah continued his trapping, but now he had reasons to come home that went beyond habit. They were not husband and wives in any sense the world below would have recognized. They were something else. Something that has no clean category in the language of that era, or possibly any era. Partners. Companions. A family assembled from loneliness and necessity, and the slow, quiet growth of something real. Because love did grow. Not the romantic kind with its demands and jealousies and scorekeeping. Something quieter. Something that asked only for presence. Something that gave without calculating the return. Mary stopped looking at Jeremiah like a potential husband and began looking at him the way you look at someone you trust with your life. Ruth stopped hoping for romance and started appreciating the actual weight and texture of what they had built. Jeremiah stopped defending himself against vulnerability and started accepting that he was no longer alone. They never married. Marriage would have required a choice, and choosing was what they had refused to do. But they lived as a family for 31 years. They raised chickens and goats and a small herd of cattle that somehow survived the mountain winters. They built a garden that produced things no one thought possible at that altitude. Travelers who stumbled upon their valley occasionally left it shaking their heads at the inexplicable contentment they found there. 3 old people on a porch in the mountains, laughing at something. Ruth died in the winter of 1896. A fever that arrived fast and left just as quickly, taking her with it. She was 57. Her last words were about the books and the conversations and the life she had never expected to find. Mary followed 3 years later. Her heart stopped one morning while she was making breakfast. She was 65. She died doing the things she had always done, taking care of the people she loved. Jeremiah buried them both on the hill behind the cabin and carved their headstones himself. Ruth's read, she found light in the mountains. Mary's read, she made a home where none had been. He lived 4 more years after Mary passed, alone again, as he had been in the beginning, but different now, in a way that could not be undone. The silence no longer felt like peace. It felt like absence. The cabin no longer felt like shelter. It felt like a monument. He died in the spring of 1903 at the age of 82. They found him in his chair on the porch, looking out at the mountains he had loved for nearly 60 years. He was smiling, the first smile anyone could remember seeing on his face in all the years they had known him. In his pocket there was a letter, addressed to no one in particular, perhaps to anyone who might someday need it. It said they had asked him to choose, and he could not. It said choosing would have meant losing. It said the only answer that made sense was the one the world would never understand. It said he never regretted it. Not for a single day. It said love was not a number. Not 1 or 2 or any count at all. It said love was whatever shape it needed to take to hold the people who mattered. It said Mary and Ruth had saved him from dying alone in the mountains with nothing but his own silence for company. It said he hoped wherever they were, they knew he was grateful. It said he was finally coming to join them. At last, the family would be complete again. They buried him between the 2 women on the hill above the valley. The 3 headstones still stand together. Here is the lesson that Jeremiah learned too late and spent 31 years being grateful for anyway. The thing most of us are never taught about love is that its deepest enemy is not heartbreak. It is the decision, made quietly, in the aftermath of pain, that we are finished, that the chapter is closed. that we have been hurt enough times to justify building walls so high that nothing real can get in. Jeremiah spent 23 years behind those walls and called it peace. It was not peace. It was the absence of risk, dressed up as contentment. The two women who stumbled into his valley did not ask him to tear the walls down. They simply stood on the other side of them long enough for him to remember that walls also keep out warmth. And his answer, the one that shocked them both, was not a loophole. It was wisdom. It was the understanding that the most important choices in life are rarely the binary ones we are handed. When someone tells you to pick one or the other, it is worth pausing long enough to ask whether there is a third option the question itself has failed to imagine. What would you choose if choosing meant losing someone you could not bear to lose? And what might you build if you simply refused to choose at all?